Is life really worth living? That's the question that philosopher Albert Camus sought to answer in his 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. In this work, Camus introduces us to the idea of absurdism, a concept born from our perpetual necessity to understand the world and derive some sort of meaning from it when no meaning exists to be found. It is important to note that neither man nor the world he inhabits are inherently absurd. Absurdism, rather, is born from the conflict between these two states, from the tension created when the rational brain of man collides with the irrational world in which he resides. Camus notes that the divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. And this uncomfortable realization, this sudden profound understanding that all of our efforts might be pointless and misdirected, can happen to any one of us at any time. It happens that the stage sets collapse. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory. Meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work. Meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time, but one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. What Camus details here can be described as the awakening of the absurd man, when one looks around and realizes that the life he lives is as repetitive and mechanical as the factory that he works in. When one asks, why? Why am I alive? Why do I do the things that I do? Why does anyone work towards anything when it will all inevitably be destroyed and forgotten in the tides of time? Why care for others? Why have children even when they too will inevitably suffer and die? If not clear already, these examples should show that this heightened consciousness is a sickness that needs to be cured. In Camus' mind, the individual has only 3 options for dealing with the absurdity of life. The first of which would be suicide. To take one's own life would be the most radical form of accepting the contradiction between the human condition and the cold, uncaring universe in which it finds itself. By choosing to divorce these two aspects by completely removing one from the plane of existence, the absurd in itself would cease to exist. However, this act of self-sacrifice does not provide a solution to the problem that the absurd thrusts upon us. Being born from reason, the issue of absurdism exists only in the mind of the individual, and as such, the problem cannot consider itself solved in your absence. Rather, it has vanished. Picture a Rubik's Cube. It becoming solved and it outright vanishing are two very different outcomes. To commit suicide, you're essentially running away from your unsolvable Rubik's Cube. Likewise, Camus rejects the notion of suicide outright. He writes, "Nothing is worth anything except through it." Camus insists that to take one's own life is to reject freedom itself, and the absurd is an experience which must be lived through. To end one's own life to uphold reason is in itself completely unreasonable. Camus implores the reader to live in an act of defiance against the absurd, but we'll delve deeper into that idea just a little later. So, with suicide being well and truly out of the question for the individual who seeks to rid themselves of the absurd, Camus examines another option. For most people who are faced with the absurd, for those that wonder, what is my purpose when all purpose turns to dust, it is common to leap headfirst into some preordained set of ideas that will restore meaning back into one's life. This can come in many forms, be it religion, a political ideology, or even just to become successful. Though he fully empathizes and understands why so many people subscribe to said systems, Camus feels strongly that accepting these comfortable beliefs is a form of intellectual surrender, precisely because you have to accept them in the first place. Camus notes, to be precise, that God is maintained only through the negation of human reason. For Camus, if the individual was to examine any religion and follow said examination to its logical conclusion, they would be left wanting. This is where the leap of faith would then come into question, an idea Camus regards as philosophical suicide. He also notes that by marrying ourselves to these systematic conceptions of the world, we are essentially merging them with our souls, and thus they become intertwined with our identities. Eric would no longer only be Eric, he would be Eric the Christian. This in itself is accompanied by two inherent problems. The first of which is that by living one's life for a particular doctrine, we voluntarily give up much of our freedom by tying our actions to said doctrine. For Camus, we become less lucid, we make less of our own decisions, doing things because we should, rather than because we want to, in service of reaching some higher goal, such as an afterlife. The other problem makes itself known much later down the line. If somebody has lived their entire life in service of reaching heaven, for example, what happens if one day they experience the absurd awakening? If the individual has spent their entire life in service of some greater goal, one that has provided their existence with comfortable purpose and meaning, a justification for existing even, then what happens to that individual if they were to find out that an afterlife does not or cannot exist? Their entire identity, their entire history would be called into question. Perhaps they would not have the strength to continue living. Having explored 2 of the 3 potential cures for the symptoms of the absurd has, so far, seemed entirely bleak. Kill your body or kill your mind. Thankfully though, it is within the final rational method of coping with the absurd that Camus offers us a much more inspiring alternative. Put simply, rebellion. Rebellion against the harsh, nonsensical stage play that we all find ourselves in. For Camus, the proper way to defeat the absurd is not to defeat it at all, but rather live in spite of it. And there is perhaps no better example of this than Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus details a man who has been punished by the gods to ceaselessly push a large boulder to the top of a mountain. He has been told that upon completing this task he will be granted his freedom. However, every time the boulder nears the summit, it falls back upon its own weight, and so the cycle continues. Sisyphus has been relentlessly pushing his boulder since long before we were born, and he will still be pushing it long after we're gone. In life, Sisyphus had made a mockery of the gods, and in return, they could think of no harsher punishment than one in which the punished is condemned to a never-ending cycle of futile and back-breaking labour. Despite this ancient Greek myth taking place in the fantastical realm of gods and monsters, Camus draws an almost unsettling relation between Sisyphus and the everyman of today. The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and his fate is no less absurd. We're all much the same as Sisyphus. We all have a boulder, and futile though it may be, Camus asks us to push it anyway. He ends his essay with a line that in itself could only be described as absurd. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Covered in sweat, with bloody hands and blistered feet, using all of his human effort and might to complete an uncompletable task, we are asked to imagine Sisyphus happy. And yet it is not unreasonable to imagine that this would be impossible. Just put yourself in his shoes and imagine how you might feel. But it is not in the image of his ascent, but rather his descent down the mountain that must give us pause. Enter the absurd hero. Camus' proposed idea for the man or woman best suited to combating the absurd, and as such, the hero must possess a particular set of values. Firstly, as touched on earlier, they must live in a constant state of perpetual rebellion against the absurd. By continuing to live, create, and act in a world without inherent meaning, the absurd hero asserts their own existence and agency, despite the fact they know that they will never emerge victorious. Secondly, the absurd hero must reject the notion of hope. Paradoxically, though it may sound, this is actually a liberation of sorts. But henceforth man enters in with his revolt and his lucidity. He has forgotten how to hope. The hell of his present is his kingdom at last. By turning away from hope, from the idea that things will one day be better, that all of our efforts will one day reap some reward, the absurd hero recognizes that heaven exists not in some distant future or far-off realm, but rather that heaven is on earth, in the here and now. To let go of hope is to free oneself from the binds of wishing things could be better. It is accepting the futility and tragedy of the present and looking for the happiness and the beauty in that present anyway. To reject hope is to appreciate our lives as they are, an idea I find to be ironically hopeful. Finally, Camus insists the absurd hero must live with passion. I must say that what counts is not the best living, but the most living. The absurd hero should seek to accumulate as many experiences in this life as is possible and not get bogged down on the relative conception of what is good and what is bad. Better to live fuller, live more, and risk experiencing more pain than to hardly live at all. The absurd hero does not care for the quality of his experiences rather than the quantity of them. They have a passion for the art of living itself and all that entails. You have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero. He is as much through his passions as through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty, in which the whole being is exerted towards accomplishing nothing. This is the price that must be paid for the passions of this earth. Sisyphus is fully aware of the futility of his labour. And yet, in his lucidity, under no illusion, he restarts his task time and time again anyway. He uses what little agency he has and revolts against his absurd circumstance. He is entirely without hope. He wishes not for his circumstances to change, but he accepts and appreciates it for what it is. To Sisyphus, he is not experiencing some tragedy, he is simply living his life. I like to imagine that on his descent, Sisyphus stops for a moment to feel the gentle heat of the sunlight upon his eyelids, to examine the intricate beauty of a flower, or to appreciate the naturally occurring melody of birdsong. We must imagine Sisyphus happy because we are Sisyphus. Though perhaps less romanticised, our lives are no less meaningless than his. But like Sisyphus, we must also push our rock, because at the end of the day, that may be all that our existence is really about. To just live. To keep pushing.